Hey y'all, what's up? My name is Jabril Kaiser. I am a organic farmer based out of San Gregorio, California, near Half Moon Bay. I am stewarding about 10 acres of land out here and growing vegetables on about two. So I'm here today to talk to you all about pesticides. And so before I begin, I just want to talk about my background with pesticides and my experience with pesticides. So at one point in college, I was an undergraduate researcher in Dr. Tyrone B. Hayes's lab, studying developmental endocrinology and the effects that herbicides, and particularly atrazine, had on frogs. And during that process, I learned a lot about the pesticide treadmill, the effects of other pesticides on the environment, and the effects of pesticides on human health. After that, I worked as a grassroots science fellow at the Pesticide Action Network North America, traveling around the Central Valley and the Central Coast of California, working with farm workers to detect pesticides that were in their air quality and helping them organize around getting that data to the ag commissioner and the regulatory agencies that monitored pesticide use exposure in their areas. So that's just a brief overview of my experience with farming, food, and pesticides. So we'll start there, right? So how do we identify pesticides? It's a good question because there are many things in our household and in the industrial and commercial processes that are pesticides. So we've got things like Raid and Roundup that we can find in our generalized house or in a household. And then we've got more agricultural pesticides like methyl bromide and large-scale atrazine applications and controlled use pesticides that are more locked up in an agricultural situation, but are still public health issues. And the way we identify and read about pesticides from a chemical standpoint and identifying them and understanding them and what they do is through something called the Material Safety Data Sheet, which can be abbreviated as MSDS. So an MSDS is a book or an online PDF that you can look up online and search up a various chemical or pesticide or chemical formulation, and it will tell you what the safety protocol is for the usage of that chemical. And usually within the MSDS, it has a triangle with 4 squares, one at the top, bottom, left, and right. Yeah, blue, yellow, and red squares in there. And the numbers, it's numbered 0 through 4. So the yellow, blue, and red all are a type of irritant or a type of flammability or a type of dangerousness that each one of these pesticides can expose you to, right? So some pesticides are flammable, some pesticides are respiratory irritants, and some of them are explosive. So those 3 different triangles will tell you if that pesticide is what type of danger that pesticide poses to a human being or to the environment, right? But we are one and the same as human beings in the environment, right? I am the environment. I am a human being at the same time. So from there, from the MSDS, you get that triangle, and then you've also got a list of all of the ways in which that chemical should be handled. And usually it is, the MSDS has pictographs of a human being with some type of personal protective equipment that is handling a chemical, right? So one pesticide may require us to wear gloves, where another pesticide may require us to wear a full bodysuit with a gas mask during its application. And the difference in danger on the MSDS will tell you how to dress appropriately to interface with that pesticide. And one thing that I tell people who are new to doing chemistry or new to interfacing with chemicals is always wear gloves when handling chemicals. And this could be household chemicals or yard chemicals, pesticides or whatever, but always wear gloves when handling these things. And the reason I say this is not to encourage people to use pesticides, but to encourage people to dispose of pesticides when they come across them. So when we go to our grandparents' house or to our family member's house and they have pesticides that have been sitting in their garage or sitting underneath their sink, off-gassing for years, and we ask them about it, like, hey, what are you going to do with this? They may not know what to do, or they may not know how to handle that pesticide safely or where to take it. So with this knowledge, right, of an MSDS, you can be like, okay, what is this chemical? Let me go on there and look it up to see what I need to do in order to handle this safely. And the way that we dispose of these chemicals is by going to a toxic waste disposal site in our area. So in California, every city almost, or every county or every region has a toxic waste disposal site that you can go to and take paint, pesticides, and other chemicals to dispose of it. And most of these disposal sites are regulated, so they're making sure that it's not being disposed of in a river or waterway or something like that. The one in Sonoma County, the nonprofit that runs the disposal site is called Clean Harbors, and they take all those toxic wastes and put them in barrels and store them somewhere, I don't know where, because these chemicals don't go away usually. They don't really biodegrade or anything like that. They just change form or are just locked away in chemical barrels and put in a landfill. So with the MSDS, we can identify on how safe, or, I always recommend at least wear gloves when you're transporting chemicals. But if it's been opened, you might want to wear a mask, an N95 mask. It doesn't have a top. You want to wear an N95 or some type of mask to keep yourself protected when disposing of these chemicals. Because as we do this work, we're going to be coming across pesticides, and we got to be ready to dispose of them or do something with them as we come across them. So I just wanted to give that plug on the MSDS and to make sure that we all know what to do when we come into contact with these pesticides. So the next thing I want to talk about is the application type of pesticides and how do people apply pesticides. It's usually when we see pesticides, we see a backpack sprayer or a plane or a tractor or something like that. And these all are specific types of applications. And what I'll do now is go through the 3 to 4 basic types of pesticide applications and how they're applied. So we've got the first one being at the smallest scale, a small pressure pump tank that you may have seen in a house or something like that at your granny's house or uncle or auntie's house, where it's just a chemical vat with the pressure pump on the top, and you pressurize it by pumping it, and then it has a spray nozzle on the end that you just can walk around with and spray. And so this is the most common at-home type application. So, and to scale that up, we've got a backpack sprayer. And this is what you may see landscapers using, or a homeowner who's like a little bit more serious about their pesticide applications, or road workers or something like that, spraying pesticides on the side of a road to keep down weeds or something like that. So the backpack sprayer is a little bit more intense. It has more pressure. Sometimes it has a motor on it, and it can spray a larger volume of pesticides. So a step up from that is a tractor application with what's called a water buffalo or a sprayer, and it's attached to the back of a tractor, and it's attached to the PTO, which is the power takeoff, and the power takeoff turns the motor inside of the implement and sprays the pesticides, which then sprays the pesticides in the orchard or vineyard or crop field or something like that. So this is where a lot of farm workers start getting pesticide drift exposure when we get to this scale of application, because once we're just spraying large volumes of pesticides with a tractor or a large machinery like that, then we have more opportunity for pesticide drift. So the tractor applications, they're driving up and down row crops, and a lot of times these row crops are up against people's houses or up against communities or schools and whatever. And when the wind blows, the pesticide that is being sprayed out of that tractor is also being sprayed onto whatever community or person is next to that tractor. So We see a lot of this happening in the Central Valley in particular, Fresno County, Tulare County, Kern County, some of the largest agricultural counties on earth with some of the most productive farmland on earth, but also some of the highest pesticide usage on earth and chemical usage on earth. California is the #1 pesticide user on planet Earth. And the next highest region that uses pesticides is Costa Rica. So that just puts things into perspective. That was a little bit of a tangent, but I wanted to take it there because that gives us an idea of how much pesticides are being used in this environment in California. So when we get to the tractor applications, people are starting to get exposed to pesticide drift, and they're applying pesticides at a bigger scale. With the next scale up, we're talking about crop dusters and helicopter applications. So crop dusters, you'll see videos of aviators flying in either a small plane that has pesticides attached to it, and it's released the same way that napalm or other war chemicals are released on humans, but onto these plants, right? So they're flying over these fields. It's called aerial applications, crop dusting. They're flying over fields and releasing pesticides on top of the field. And so for more precision applications, per se, they use helicopters. So they use large helicopters, the same type of helicopters that firefighters use to drop fire retardants. The pesticide applicators are using to fly over fields and do very precision applications. But oftentimes in weather conditions, windy conditions, these pesticides are sprayed even further, and there's even more drift than when the tractors are spraying the pesticides because of the speed at which these aircraft are moving and the height at which the pesticides are being applied. So the crop dusting and the aerial applications are the most dangerous ways that pesticides are applied because of its ability to drift over and to pollute communities all over the area. So a little story is I was in the Central Valley in a neighborhood called Cantua Creek in Fresno County. And one of the youth out there was telling me about how him and his homies were playing basketball at their high school and at lunch. So they were at lunch playing basketball, and a crop duster flew over their blacktop and sprayed their entire high school with pesticides. And it was so close that when he was playing basketball, he threw his basketball up and it hit the bottom of the plane. So there's a lot. These crop dusting people don't necessarily, they're just spraying stuff for money, right? They don't necessarily care about human life. They're not being reprimanded about their pesticide applications. And oftentimes they're in collaboration with the agricultural commissioner and the California Department of Food and Agriculture, who's supposed to be managing these pesticide applications. So we've got a whole system that's not necessarily set up to support human and the life of the earth and living beings, right? It's a system that's set up to kill life off, and it's hard to function and be healthy in an environment like that. Okay. And so the next thing is talking about how the people that are being exposed to pesticides are often poor farm workers who live in rural areas that don't have a lot of access to medical care, don't have access to clean water because all of their groundwater has been contaminated by pesticides and other environmental contaminants like heavy metals and fertilizers and nitrates and stuff like that. So we're talking about undocumented workers. We're talking about poor immigrant workers. We're talking about rural workers and other people who don't have the same protections as white folks in this society. And these are the people that are getting exposed to the most pesticides, right? And these are the people that are dying from pesticide exposure. So when we talk about poor folks, black folks, indigenous farm workers getting exposed to pesticides, we're talking about an environmental justice issue, right? Where black and brown people are getting exposed to these toxic, life-threatening chemicals, while white folks are the ones telling them to administer it and paying for that pesticides to be applied in these communities. So we're talking about this on a systemic level within capitalism, right? Where capitalism is actually facilitating the premature death of these farm workers, the premature death of these black folks applying pesticides at schools and shit like Dwayne Johnson. We're talking about capitalists paying money to kill life on earth, to kill off life using chemicals that were used for war. And so I'm framing the pesticide uses as an environmental justice issues because if you look at all the groundwater contamination and stuff like that that's happening in these rural communities, where the people that don't have water filtration access, the people who don't have clean water, are the farm workers, are the poor folks, are the people who live in these communities. So the usage of pesticides becomes an environmental justice issue and also a human health issue, those are not really separate, right? The academy and the society likes to separate those, but in reality, they're the same thing. So from there, I just wanted to talk about how pesticides really just degrade our environment. So when these chemicals are being sprayed on the environment, right, we've got a level of these chemicals don't break down well. These chemicals are not meant to be, in some cases they were created, the chemical companies would like you to understand, these chemicals break down or whatever, but in reality they just change form. So when the sun beams on them and break these chemicals down, or they're exposed to high temperatures, the chemicals don't necessarily degrade into biodegradable compounds. They degrade into less toxic compounds that are still semi-toxic to the biology of the planet. And pesticides, particularly herbicides and insecticides, do a lot of groundwater and surface water contamination. So when people who are applying pesticides are applying them and it's contaminating groundwater and surface water, that affects the entire watershed. So we're talking about animals and humans who are drinking from the watershed, trees, right? If herbicides are being sprayed in an environment and those chemicals are being recycled up through the water cycle in the clouds and then being rained back down on society in significant amounts, right? I'm not talking about amounts that are negligible. We're talking about primary research that shows pesticides are being rained down on our population in significant amounts. And so these herbicides, insecticides, pesticides, all these chemicals are contaminating the water cycle and also contaminating the organisms and life that is living in these watersheds and in these forests and stuff like that. And if we go to these industrialized agricultural areas, you can see that they're quite devoid of life. Their watersheds are completely concretized and put in concrete canals, and the water is completely incarcerated, and the streams are incarcerated and such. So when we look at this, when we look at these substances and we look at these pesticides, right, they are heavily contaminating our groundwater and severely degrading our environmental and natural resources. So to back and wrap all this up, right, the petroleum industry essentially created pesticides as a way to get rid of some of their waste products. And now we've got organizations like the EPA, we've got organizations like the CDFA who regulate pesticides and decide to ban pesticides when enough people have died from them or whatever. So what has happened is something called the circle of poison, where these banned pesticides by the US EPA, federally, and the state EPAs and such, are still being manufactured in the United States, but instead of being sold to farmers in the United States, in the European Union. They're being exported to countries in the global south for agricultural production in those regions. So once those exported pesticides are applied onto crops who are also being grown in industrialized fashion for export back to the United States, those crops that have been sprayed with the banned pesticides in the global south, those crops are being exported to the United States for consumption by the people in the United States, effectively creating a circle of poison, right? Where we don't necessarily have to be spraying that pesticide in our country to be exposed to the pesticide, because people in the global south are spraying it on food that people in the United States are then consuming. And that's something that's described as the circle of poison. And there's documentaries written about it, and I really recommend y'all looking into the circle of poison more, because it especially applies to imported tropical goods like mangoes and avocados and peppers and out of season crops that are not being grown in the US in wintertime, stuff like that, and bananas and such. So there's minimal testing and regulation around that as well. So yeah, that's the circle of poison. And the chemical companies created pesticides